He's been an active scientific skeptic since founding the New England Skeptical Society in 1996. Wow. He is an internationally recognized science communicator who has spent years investigating paranormal claims, conspiracy theories, and exposing pseudoscience. He's a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, CSI, along with names that you may know, such as Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, plus a couple of other scientists that may even be mentioned tonight, namely Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins are on that list. Steve is the host of the award-winning science podcast, The Skeptics Guide to the Universe, which tackles science news and controversies in an engaging and entertaining format. He authors the award-winning Neurologica blog, which covers neuroscience, general science, scientific skepticism, critical thinking, and the intersection of science with the media. Steve is also the founding and senior editor of and regular contributor to the Science-Based Medicine website. That's an influential medical blog dedicated to issues of science and medicine. He's the author of 3 books: The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe about critical thinking and science, The Skeptic's Guide to the Future about futurism and technology, and the audiobook, The Skeptic's Guide to Alternative Medicine. He's produced 2 video courses for the teaching company, including Medical Myths and Your Deceptive Mind. I saw the Deceptive Mind. That was fantastic. I'm sure the other one is too, but I didn't see that one yet. Your Deceptive Mind was one of the first things I ever saw by the teaching company. Steve is an associate professor of clinical neurology at Yale University with subspecialty certification in neuromuscular and headache medicine, and his knowledge of neuroscience has been critical to his work in promoting critical thinking. Lastly, let me say that discovering Steve's podcast, The Skeptics Guide to the Universe, about 10 years ago was what set me on the path to becoming a skeptical activist myself and a columnist for CSI. So I have to thank him greatly for that. And my column name, by the way, came from his brother Jay doing a shout out to me before I got an offer to write for them. So thank you so much, Steve, for all you do, and welcome to RfRx.
So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Kara. Thanks everyone for having me here. It's a interesting topic to talk about. I think this is exactly the kind of things that we do need to be talking about, the things where there is a lot of disagreement. It's fun to talk about things we mostly agree on, but you don't learn as much when you do that. And I think our goal should always be to, on topics that are especially controversial, to find common ground. I mean, if we're a rationalist community, right? Atheists, rationalists, humanists, skeptics. Uh, finding common ground, getting this, agreeing on the science. I mean, that shouldn't be an unworkable goal, right? I mean, we should be able to get there, and it's been very perplexing. Why this subject is so controversial and why it's so difficult for even otherwise well-respected and experienced science communicators to agree on some basic things. I hope that one day we will get there. I'm trying to move in that direction, but I'm going to talk, over the next hour or so about why I think we haven't been able to do that. Now the question is, you could frame it as, is biological sex in humans strictly binary or not? Um, doesn't sound like that should be that difficult a question to resolve. I do think there is an objective answer to that question, but it's been remarkably difficult to get people to agree. And of course, there's no mystery. I'm not going to pretend like we don't know why that is. It's because we are in the midst of a culture war that is trying to deny the existence, the legitimacy, the basic rights of the trans community. That's it. That's what's happening. It is being framed as really a moral panic. There's really no other way to put that, and it has that moral panic has captured even some of the some experienced skeptics and science communicators that previously enjoyed, I think, pretty universal admiration in the skeptical community. So that's been one of the most disappointing aspects of this, of how divisive this has been, which I also think is partly deliberate, not on the part of skeptics, but on the part of political operatives who have found a very convenient wedge in our own community, which is just ridiculous in my opinion, but it is what it is. So let's talk a little bit about this. I think no matter what side of the issue or where on the spectrum of this issue you are politically, ideologically, you should get the science right. And whatever view you're promoting, you should have at least enough of an understanding of the science that we're going to be framing our advocacy in a way that is scientifically bulletproof, as much as it can be. It's more effective communication, it's more effective advocacy if that is the case. So um, for the next bit of the talk, I'm going to show you mainly slides. These are slides I used when I talked about this at SciCon last year. Is biological sex in humans strictly, mostly, basically binary? Um, while I think when I talk to other scientists and science communicators, even those ones that completely disagree with me, we generally agree on the facts of this issue, which is remarkable. So how is it that we can agree on the facts and yet disagree so strongly about how to discuss this issue? And it comes down to something, again, that is just, in my opinion, so incredibly ridiculous that we have to find a way to get past this. It comes down to, honestly, a stubborn insistence on a certain semantic definition, on like arbitrary choices about um, categorization and semantics, but they're being framed as, well, this one choice is the only scientific choice. And if you disagree with that, you're being unscientific, you're being an ideologue. Without any recognition that whether or not you think biological sex in humans is binary kind of depends on your definition of biological sex and your definition of binary and how you go about creating those categories. Now, these are all interesting things in science. We need to label things, we need to define our terms operationally, we need to make deliberate choices about how we categorize things, but we shouldn't confuse our definitions and our categories with reality. Reality is what it is, regardless of how we choose to label or to categorize it. And I think at the end of the day, that the difference is not over the facts, it's over the definitions of like what binary means. Again, it's just ridiculous when you strip it down. Um, so just as an example, I made this graphic. I mean, so taking a look at this set of data, right? How would you say that this set of data is binary or not? And when you look at it, it's like, well, yeah, there's circles with blue shapes in them and circles with pink shapes in them. So there's two types of circles. So it's binary. But as you look closer, you go, oh, wait a minute. There's a circle down here that has blue and pink shapes in it. And there's one over here that's mostly pink, but it has a purple shape in it. So now what would you say? Is this set of things binary or is it not binary? Right? Well, it kind of depends on where you draw the line or what you consider to be binary. It's mostly binary. It's not strictly binary. You can't really disagree with that. But what terms you use to describe it. Well, if it's not strictly binary, then what word would you use to describe it? There really isn't one. There really isn't an obvious agreed upon term that captures all of the complexity we're seeing here. So let me ask you another question. This is more fun in front of a live audience. Do you think this person is a man or a woman? Just based upon looking at them. Now, this is an actor. She is, a fairly famous actor. You may recognize her. You may have seen her on TV or in the movies. I'll tell you, this is not a trans person, right? This person was identified female at birth, lived her life as a woman, and has a typical female anatomy. And yet, whether or not you consider this person a woman or a man is actually biologically fairly complicated. And I'll get to why that is in a moment. on a related issue, just to broaden the point or to step back for a moment, is this animal a bird or a non-avian dinosaur? I have to say non-avian dinosaur because birds are technically dinosaurs. This is a rendering of an Archaeopteryx. Right? Archaeopteryx is, even though it's not technically directly on the path from theropod dinosaurs to birds, it's pretty much half bird, half theropod, right? And it has wings, it can fly, but it has a bony tail, it has teeth, it lacks certain adaptations for flight. It's pretty close to being half theropod, half bird as you can get. So, is it a bird or is it a non-avian dinosaur? Is it a theropod dinosaur? Well, it kind of depends on how you choose to define those categories. Notorious creationist Dwayne Gish exploited this ambiguity in the language to say, well, he literally said in a lecture trying to delegitimize evolution as a scientific topic, it's clearly a bird, right? It has feathers, it flies, it's a bird, right? So without explicitly saying so, what he was saying was that his operational definition of a bird is a creature with feathers who flies, although an ostrich is a bird and it doesn't fly. But in any case, I guess you could make an exception for secondarily flightless birds like penguins and ratites. But someone else could say, well, yeah, but he's got teeth and a bony tail, so he's a theropod dinosaur. And in fact, if you looked at the skeleton of this creature without the feather impressions, you could not tell it apart from a theropod dinosaur. And in fact, paleontologists mistook these creatures for dinosaurs, for non-avian dinosaurs, until the feather impressions were noticed. So does it really matter if we call it a bird or if we call it a theropod dinosaur? Does that change what it is? Does it change the fact that it's a transitional fossil, that it's 50-50 bird and theropod dinosaur? I don't think so. It is what it is, right? All right, let's talk a little bit about biological sex in humans. Now, man, when I first wrote about this, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna start really basic. Like I noticed that there was obviously a lot of disagreement among science communicators, even people who were writing for me on science-based medicine and who I had greatly respected as a science communicator, disagreeing strongly over like whether or not biological sex is strictly binary or not, when it clearly isn't. But I said, well, let's just start with the real basics that nobody could disagree on, right? So let's talk about what are the features of biological sex in humans: chromosomes, gametes, hormones, reproductive organs, genitalia, secondary sexual characteristics, right? That's pretty much the agreed upon suite of features under the umbrella of biological sex in humans. You could think of it as, humans are a sexually dimorphic species, and those are the features that vary between men and women. And yet, there are people who disagree with that, who disagree that those are the features of biological sex. Amazingly, unbelievably, and I don't believe for a second that they would bother to disagree with this if it weren't for the trans issue. And in fact, I've never even encountered the notion that these things are not all considered biological sex until this issue came up. I'll tell you what the alternative is in a moment, but these are the features that vary according to biological sex, between men and women. It starts with the chromosomes, right? So XY for male, XX for female. That's pretty much universal to mammals. If you have an XY chromosome, you are going to make your gametes are going to be testes that produce sperm. If you're XX, they'll be ovaries that produce ova. The testes produce testosterone, which then determines in development, right? As when you're developing from an embryo, you will develop along the male pathway. And if you have low testosterone, high estrogen, you will develop along the female pathway. There's actually other genes and other hormones involved. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the basic schema. And that includes not only your again reproductive organs, also your genitalia, and also your secondary sexual characteristics. So now, so if that's how you define biological sex, it's all of these features, right? How do you define binary? And I actually defined both biological sex and binary when I wrote about it, like what I mean by those terms, yet people still felt they needed to disagree with my chosen definitions. But how do you how do you define binary? Well, in order to be, and I even clarified, all right, let's just talk about being strictly binary, right? If you're strictly binary, that means two things. It means each one of these categories has two and only two options. It also means that that every single human being can be unambiguously slotted into one of or two of those options, right? If there are people who are exceptions to that, then humanity is not strictly binary when it comes to biological sex. That again is kind of an unavoidable conclusion. I unbelievably have people disagree. Well, binary doesn't actually mean that. It only means there's two choices. Well, no, you could find. I mean, I hate to do the dictionary definition thing, but you know, even if you do that simplistic thing, it's in there. It's not only are there two choices, but they have to be, they have to be unambiguously clear. There's no overlap. There's no ambiguity between the two. So biological sex fails the binary test in every possible way, right? If you look at just the chromosomes, well, there are some people who are neither XY nor XX, right? They're triple X, they're XXY, whatever. So not all people fit into a chromosomal binary. Um, Gametes are the most binary. There's really very few, like rare exceptions. So even there, you can't say it's strictly binary, but let's say even that I grant you that that's binary, that those few people who have ovotestes and who are considered to be true hermaphrodites in the medical literature, that we just say, well, they're so rare, we're going to actually literally call them exceptions and just say they don't affect what we think about this. But hormones, testosterone and estrogen, these are bell curves. These vary pretty extensively in both typical males and typical females. There's also another aspect to this. That's not on this list, and that is, which I think I will include under hormones. It's not only your absolute hormone levels, it's also your receptor sensitivity. You can have testosterone, but your testosterone receptors don't work, right? They just don't respond well to testosterone. And so you develop as if you have low testosterone, right? It's called androgen insensitivity syndrome. There's also genes that are not on the sex chromosomes that also, and other hormones that also affect development. So again, that's all under the hormone tab. Again, not strictly binary. Also, there are hormones that can mimic androgens, and could be, for example, XX individuals who range the entire spectrum from typical female anatomy to typical male anatomy because they're making exogenous androgens. And then just similarly, there's XY individuals who can span the entire spectrum from typically male to typically female because they have degrees of androgen insensitivity. And then the organs basically relate to that, right? So, whether you develop like the male reproductive or the female reproductive organs. Genitalia is not strictly binary. It's pretty much bimodal. You can have people with literally ambiguous genitalia. That's the technical term. They have ambiguous genitalia. There's while maybe 98% or so of people fit into, you could say, yeah, that's a penis or that's a vagina. There's that percentage in the middle where it's like, yeah, that's like a vagina-ish penis, or that's a pretty large clitoris that's kind of verging on the border of being a small penis, like where a large clitoris and small penis basically blend one into the other without any demarcation line between the two. So again, not strictly binary. And then the suite of secondary sexual characteristics vary pretty much bimodally as well. Um, we see that in every day, the typical female type or the typical masculine type. And that includes, by the way, the brain, which is affected by secondary sexual characteristics, right? The brain development is affected by the hormonal environment of the womb during development. And that, determines, along with other factors, sexual orientation and gender identity. That, as far as we could tell, they have way more data with sexual orientation than gender identity, but the data for gender identity is trending in this direction. I'll talk more about this in a moment. But the brain's an organ, it's biological, its development is affected by hormones, it is part of biological sex in humans. So, what is a typical male? A typical male has features that you would align unambiguously all into the XY column. Typical female, you could align unambiguously in the XX column. But not everybody fits into that category. Let's get back to our example here. So this is a person with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, right? She is XY, had until they were surgically removed testes that produce sperm. Now the sperm wasn't functional because her testes were undescended, and anyone with undescended testes, because of temperature regulation, those sperm never fully mature and are never functional. But they're sperm, right? And has typical male levels of testosterone. However, um, did not develop a uterus because that's a separate hormone that is functional in her, but otherwise developed completely along the typical female line. She has a vagina. Again, was identified female at birth. Has a typical female body. In fact, people with CAIS, the complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, if anything, they're hyper female bodied because most women have some testosterone, whereas she effectively has zero testosterone. So she's pegged all the way to the female morphology end of the spectrum. Her sexual orientation is typical female, heterosexual. Her gender identity is female. So is she a man or a woman? Again, she's an Archaeopteryx of biological sex. She's pretty much half man, half woman if you look at these columns of features. Now, she considers herself a woman. Most people interacting with her, and etc., think that she's a woman. She married a man who doesn't consider himself to be homosexual, and in fact, she was an adult before she even discovered that she wasn't a typical female. She didn't. Most women with CAIS don't have no idea that they're XY and that they have testes and make testosterone. They're girls, right? And then at some point they don't go through menstruation, and then that usually prompts a visit to the doctor, and where they discover, oh, okay, you have CAIS, you're an XY female. In her case, her parents chose not to tell her. They said, we have to remove your ovaries because they're abnormal and they're a medical risk. They removed her ovaries. They really were removing her undescended testes. And then she didn't discover until later in adulthood that she was an XY female with CAIS. So again, we consider these kinds of conditions with the current technical term now is a difference of sexual development. Difference of sexual development. What percentage of the population has a DSD? It depends on where you draw the line, what you count as a DSD. But even taking a maximally restrictive, definition, it's at least like 0.6, 0.7%. It could be as much as 1.5% or so. It depends on what you count, right? And what counts as a difference of sexual development is also an arbitrary categorization, right? It's like, is Pluto a planet? or is it a dwarf planet? There's no objective answer to that. It depends on what definition you're using and what defining characteristics you think are important. Um, and that's, I think, part of something that we need to realize. Part of a very important concept here is that categorization is often context dependent, right? Meaning that what category, what definition we choose to use may be different in different situations, and that's okay. Doesn't have to be the same everywhere. So for me as a physician, this concept, I already knew this concept even before I applied it to this issue. Doctors confront this every day. The categories that we have to think about every day are disease diagnoses and how do we make diagnoses. That's, I can give you a 2-hour lecture just on that question. What are different diagnoses? How do we make diagnoses? But the real quickie version is that a diagnosis has a specific purpose, right? It's not just not objective. There isn't just one way to make a diagnosis. You can make a clinical diagnosis. You could make a pathological diagnosis. You can make a biopsy diagnosis. You could make a diagnosis that's based upon some specific test, like a blood test or an MRI scan or whatever. And then, even then, when you make that choice, you run into the lumper splitter problem. Are these different subtypes of the same thing or different things? There's no right or wrong answer to that. And eventually we decide, well, why are we even making this label? Like, what's the purpose of the diagnosis? And that evolves over time. I've been doing medicine for long enough now to see diagnoses go through the evolution of why we use them. So at first they're largely descriptive, meaning when we first come up, we identify, know that this pathological condition we're calling a disease exists, or people come in, they complain of a suite of complaints. They have certain complaints, they have certain signs on their exam, certain natural history. We describe that and we say that's this label, right? That's this diagnosis, but it's purely descriptive, and it's purely epidemiological and just what patients talk about and present with when they come in. And then as we learn more about the disease, we start to add pathological and diagnostic criteria to the diagnosis, so it evolves that way. And then once we have a treatment for it, then the only thing that matters really is who gets treated. And then the diagnosis shifts further to who gets treated, right? So that's completely different ways to use a diagnosis. So the same thing, I think, exists with biological sex. And this is, again, something that the Jerry Coynes and Richard Dawkins of the world, I don't think get. It's why are we even dividing humanity up into men and women? What's the purpose of this? And if you're taking a abstract academic evolutionary perspective and you want to come up with a criterion that applies to frogs and newts and people and bats, then as Coyne says, well, then the only thing that really works across all sexually reproducing animals is gametes. So we're going to define biological sex as gametes, right? This is the gametes only approach. And man, they vociferously defend the gametes only approach, because that's the one that gets them to the binary system, right? Because gametes are the only one that you could reasonably argue is basically binary. Again, you still have to exclude very rare exceptions. It's okay, but I think as P.Z. Myers said, I read him say, last time I checked, people were not single-celled creatures, right? We're talking about biological sex in humans, and we don't have to restrict ourselves to features that are universal to all sexually reproducing creatures. I don't care about defining biological sex in frogs when I'm defining biological sex in humans. I could use all of the features of biological sex in humans and not restrict myself to features that are universal. The universality is one criterion. You're arbitrarily deciding that that's the criterion you want to use. But is it functional? Does it make sense? It's like saying, hey, I want to use this criterion to define this diagnosis, even though it says nothing about whether or not you should be treated. It says nothing about your prognosis, and it predicts nothing, but it's a good objective way to make the diagnosis. Like, well, good for you. What's it good for? It's not anything useful. So gametes have a use, but not every use, right? So let's give some examples. All right, but I love this. I just have to give this example of categorization. I love asking people, they say that, yeah, categorization is objective. I go, really? How many continents are there? How many continents are there? Think about it. Are there 7? Well, how do you define continent? Is Europe and Asia one continent or 2? Why is it 2? Why isn't that one continent? Is North and South America one continent or 2? Was it one continent that we turned into 2 when we made the Panama Canal? Again, what's the definition of a continent? Why is Greenland an island and Australia a continent? I know it's deceptive because Mercator proof of projection, whatever, but still, like there's arbitrary decisions that we make about what counts as a continent. And it depends on the context. Is it a geological continent? Is it a geopolitical continent? Is it a cultural continent? That it depends, right? It depends on what your criteria, what your purpose is. All right, let's get just back to the generic list here. So,
Steve,
yeah.
since you have that list up, there was some chatter on it, so I wanted to ask you right straight out. Some people were confused about why you have uterus and not
Oh, I know. Testes should be up there with gametes, and it's really just
ovaries and testes.
yeah, and that uterus should just be vas deferens and the male stuff. I agree. Yeah, I should update that. So, but that aside, the so when we're saying, all right, we're going to categorize people as male and female, and we want to be scientific about it. We want to be logical and consistent, internally consistent about it. But we do have to say, well, why are we doing it? What purpose are we doing it for? So to give you an obvious example, let's say we want to create male and female elite sports leagues, right? I want to create a league of sports for female-bodied athletes in order to protect them, to make so that they can compete in a safe and meaningful way, right? And I think most people agree with that. That's okay. That's fine to say you want to do that. You want to create, again, especially at elite sports level. It's hard to defend that at the elementary school level, But when you're talking about elite sports like the Olympics, having, I think it's sports specific, but for some sports, it makes sense to have a category for female-bodied athletes that are, to ensure that they can compete safely and meaningfully, right? That's okay. Still leaves you with the problem of how you're going to define that. How are you going to define a female athlete? I'll give you a hint. We don't do it by gametes. And gametes would probably be the last thing on that list that you would use to decide who should be a female athlete. It's not genitalia. Genitalia are pretty irrelevant to whether or not to elite sports competition, right? It's not whether or not you have a uterus. So as we wrestle with this question, people who I think are thinking about this in a meaningful and nuanced way have progressed the conversation so much. So one thing that they say, which I think is a good way to approach this, is they say, listen, what we're interested in is a league for athletically female people, athletically female. That way, it kind of divorces it. It's kind of saying that's the context. The context is elite sports. We're interested in a league for athletically female people and athletically male people, and we're going to define what that means. We're going to operationally define what that means, which means they're not saying that you're not socially a female, you're not neurologically a female, you're not a woman. They're not saying any of that. They're saying that this league is for athletically female athletes. And we're going to define that mainly by whether you are female bodied, and that has to do with your not only your testosterone level but your receptor sensitivity, but also did you go through puberty, as a male or a female, and your current hormonal status and for how long. So um, again, I think this should be sport specific. I think we have, there's a lot of evidence that we could bring to bear on this, but we need more evidence, to really drill down deeper. But you could say, and most sports are doing it pretty reasonably. They're saying, well, if you are went through puberty as a male and you are now are a female and you want to compete in female sports, you have to have been on testosterone blockers for 2 years and cross-sex hormone, female hormones for 2 years, and then you will meet criteria for competing in our female-bodied league or female league for female athletically female people. Okay, that's reasonable. That's you're at least trying to come up with meaningful biological criteria, and they're only saying that it applies in this context. And so clearly, in that context, what matters is really the secondary sexual characteristics. That's the thing that matters to athletics. But what about prisons? Should somebody who is how do we define male and female for male prisons and female prisons? That's more complicated. And we don't necessarily care so much about whether they're athletically female, but we certainly want to know if they are, if they're going to be safe in a female prison, and if they're going to be safe in a male prison. Right? So somebody who is, say, a trans female in a male prison, they experience some ridiculous, like 12 times as much violence as cis male prisoners do. So clearly there's a disconnect there, and the state has a vested interest in protecting them. At the same time, we don't want to put female prisoners at risk. And so we need to find a balance there that probably will prioritize a different set of features than the athletically female one does. Context matters. You could be reproductively female and reproductively male, which matters if depending on what kind of doctor you have to see, in terms of like OBGYN or a urologist, right? So anyway, so the context absolutely matters. And we shouldn't pretend that like it's gametes and only gametes and that's it, and nothing else, everything else is secondary or derivative, or it determines sex but it isn't sex. They play all kinds of some ridiculous semantic games to try to say that only gametes count. And then they say, well, and anyone who has a difference of sexual development, they also don't count because they're different or they're pathological or they're not normal or whatever. It's all, literally they say it's binary, but we're only going to count the people who are binary, and we're only going to count the one definition that we choose to use because it also applies to frogs, and that's why we're choosing to use that one definition. But they can't disagree on the basic fact that all of these things vary by biological sex, and they can't disagree on the fact that there are millions of human beings in the world who do not fit into this binary. They can't disagree with that, so they have to come up with this ridiculous semantic categorization argument, and then anyone who disagrees, they pretend like that's the way it's been all along, and including, like, it's amazing to read people in the comments of these articles, like, they just found out literally 10 minutes ago that that's the definition they're supposed to use, and then they're now insulting other people who are not using that definition, as if like it was self-evident or obvious all along, which is ridiculous. But let me talk for a few minutes about sexual orientation and gender identity, because this, as far as we can tell, and this again, I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming when it comes to sexual orientation, and it's preliminary with gender identity, but it's rapidly heading in this direction. These are neurological brain phenomena. These are right. I think we're past the point where any substantial portion of the population thinks that you could turn people gay or that sexual orientation is a choice. Pretty much you're born with your sexual orientation. It's a feature that's present as early in your life as its meaning, as soon as you can experience a sexual orientation, you pretty much have your sexual orientation, and it's pretty persistent throughout your lifetime. Although I have to say, some people are fluid when it comes to that, but that is just part of their sexual orientation. Right? That doesn't mean that that's strictly binary, that you are 100% homosexual or 100% heterosexual. A lot of people are a little fluid when it comes to that, or it can be especially fluid before, during, and shortly after puberty, etc. And it could also be under social influence. The thing about the brain that's different than, say, the genitalia, the brain is an organ that evolved to adapt to the environment, to culture. And so you're never going to be able to completely strip that away from any manifestation of neurological function. It's always interacting with the environment. That's kind of the whole point of the brain, is to adapt rapidly to the environment, rather than genetically, to the environment. So, but having said that, pretty much you're born with your sexual orientation. It is a function of your brain. It is a brain trait. We call that a trait. It's a neurological trait. It is like your core personality features. You are born introverted or extroverted, somewhere along that spectrum. And man, is it really hard to change that. You can, even if you actively work to change how introverted or extroverted you are, it's remarkably resistant to any intervention. Of course, your introversion, extroversion is fluid and will depend on the situation. It will depend on how drunk you are, and what people you're with, and what mood you're in, and all sorts of things, how much energy you have, etc. But still, that range of your introversion, extroversion in different situations is your personality trait that will be with you for your whole life. Same thing with your sexual orientation. Now, is gender identity a brain trait, or is it a cultural choice? Is it an environmental factor? Is it, well, um, there for it seems to be certainly epidemiologically, right? If you just say, well, most people, have a gender identity, whether they, experience it explicitly or not, from a pretty young age, like 3 or 4, and it's persistent throughout their life, right? Again, for some people that might be, I'm pretty fluid, but again, it is what it is. Um, People don't generally change their gender identity, and so, you know, a majority of people who have a transgender identity, for example, they um, they have it at a very young age, and it is remarkably persistent, right? And in fact, that's the criteria. One of the criteria that are used to determine eligibility for gender affirming care, that your trans identity is robust, young in origin, and persistent, right? You're clear, it's strong, and it's consistent. If it's fluid or recent or whatever, then we, the standard of care is to wait, because most of those people will or don't have persistent trans identity, and so you can, divide, prepubescent or pubescent people into those categories. People who think that they're trans, at that age, they tend to differentiate pretty easily into those who have persistent neurological traits versus people who are just questioning or transitional or whatever. It's not as persistent. So there's different subcategories depending on those features, and we're learning more about that, and we're getting better at predicting, like, whose trans identity is going to be more persistent. We're trying to minimize things like regret for gender affirming care. And actually, we're pretty damn good at it. When you look at the data, the regret rate is less than 1%, which is lower than knee surgery. I mean, it's really good. So even with the evidence that we have so far, we're actually pretty good at determining when people have a persistent neurological trait determined transgender identity. So I do think we need to think of that as a neurological trait, as part of developmental biology. Why shouldn't we? It has all the features of that. Is that a difference of sexual development? I think it is. It's not technically classified as such, but when you think about it, like how do we categorize a DSD? Why should the penis count and the brain not count? Right? What's more central to your identity, your genitals or your brain? I would argue it's your brain. If you are a typical male and identify as male, and this is not possible, but if in a theoretical universe where I could take your brain and put it into a female's body, would you then identify as a female? Or would you identify as a male in a female's body? Right? I mean, obviously, no one's experienced that, but I imagine I would still identify as a male, regardless of what body I happen to have. And so, because my identity, everything you are, everything you think, you feel, your, the way you conceive of reality, that's all happening in your brain. You are your brain, right? And if you are your brain, then that is what is central to your identity. It's more important than your penis or your vagina, right? Your brain is way more central to your identity than any other aspect of your anatomy. So why shouldn't that count? It's part of biological sex. It varies. And people have. And we're still trying to disentangle the various biological factors that influence and determine things like sexual orientation as a neurological trait. So whether it's technically categorized as a DSD, it certainly behaves like a DSD, right? A difference of sexual development. Um, so I think, again, wherever you fall, whether you agree with me about sports or disagree with me, or whatever we think we should be doing with prisons or with public bathrooms or with gender affirming care, wherever you fall on these applications of what I'm talking about, we should have a firm scientific grounding. We should get our ducks in a row in terms of terminology, and not overstate the case one way or the other. I'll say, and this can be controversial in this audience, I don't personally like the phrase a trans woman is a woman, not because it's not true, because certainly I get the point of it is, and in certain contexts it's true. It's just that I think our position should be biological sex is a multidimensional, complex developmental phenomenon. And whether or not somebody is what people are is complicated, right? And yet there are some people who are, entirely male or typical female, but there's millions of people who are not. And those people are they're not strictly binary. And it's not simple, but by trying to substitute, again, a context dependent, simplistic one perspective and say that this is the case kind of works against what we should be promoting, which is a more thorough, nuanced, complete, and scientifically and logically valid way of thinking and talking about biological sex in humans that accurately accounts for all of humanity and can form a good basis for having ideological and political discussions about how are we going to optimize everybody's rights and liberties and freedoms and dignity, et cetera, given that this is the messy biological reality. As much as we would like things to be simple and agreeing with our position, they aren't. And we have to just to acknowledge that. It's like, a trans woman's a trans woman. They're not the same as a cis woman. That's kind of the point, is that biological sex is complicated and multidimensional, and categories and labels and everything are context dependent, and they depend on what your purpose is. And that doesn't fit well on a bumper sticker, though. I get it. And I know we have to find ways of promoting our our what we think of as important in terms of human rights, but in a way that doesn't set us up for being attacked as being anti-science or internally inconsistent. It's tough. It's the thing that we always wrestle with skeptics. The other side has nice, good bumper sticker, promotions, and we're always like, well, actually, it's complicated and blah blah blah. It's the messaging is always difficult, but that's a burden that we have to bear. But at least as science communicators, we should get on the same fucking page on this issue, and we shouldn't be arguing about definitions and semantics as if it's real, as if it's something more than just our arbitrary definitions. And we certainly shouldn't be destroying our each other's reputations to the delight of the religious right and white nationalists. I mean, talk about being made tools of the very thing that you're supposed to be against. It's so ironically horrific that is happening. So again, my goal is not to like trash talk people that I disagree with or undermine them as science communicators. It's to say, can we please get on the same page about the science and find the common ground, and then we can disagree. I don't care if you disagree with me about trans athletes in sports, but let's do it without ridiculous, stupid, scientific nonsense. Can we do that? And then we can have a meaningful discussion. But we have no hope of having a meaningful discussion while we're debating ridiculous semantics. We just have to get past this phase of the discussion. But I honestly, I hate to be pessimistic, but I just don't see it happening anytime soon. And I've been actively trying to do it. And all the people that that are on the other side, I have argued with on this, and they are remarkably stubborn. And I don't know how to break through. I have not figured out yet how to break through.
Steve,
I'm
at
open to
SciCon,
ideas.
you made an offer in the live recording of the Skeptics Guide for Jerry Coyne to come on and
Yeah, so
debate you. Did it happen? Did that ever happen?
we emailed him and we invited him on to the SGU, and he declined. He politely declined, to come on the SGU to discuss this issue. He said, "Oh, I'm not good in debate. I don't, basically didn't feel like, not that it was going to be a debate. I wanted it to be a discussion, again, a search for common ground. But he did not feel comfortable having this discussion with me on our podcast. But he did feel comfortable after refusing to come on my show to talk about it, to trash talk me in his blog, and then not allow me to comment on his blog, which I thought was bad form. But that's a problem. It's like we doesn't even trust to have me comment on his blog or to have a discussion with me on my show. It's why is that? We're not gonna fix this issue if that's the case. I think we need to feel comfortable enough, which is again also partly why I don't want to like attack people. I'm trying to talk to them about this. I do think he's a scientist. He's a good science communicator. I think he has all the intellectual tools, to at least understand, at least don't mischaracterize my position. I haven't even been able to get them to that point where they're not mischaracterizing my position. It's like, how many times do I have to explain to you what my position is before you'll stop mischaracterizing it? They're just stuck in this rhetorical loop, and I think they're just, I do think it's a information ecosystem, problem at this
So,
point.
so this might be a good time to ask you this question. There were
Yeah.
some people were kind of implying that maybe you're not characterizing Coyne, Dawkins, et cetera's position as a steel man, but you're straw manning it. Like, what's your comment
Tell
on
me how.
what is their position in your opinion?
So it depends on who you talk to. So I know what Jerry Coyne's position is. He thinks that because that biological sex, like that gametes are the unifying evolutionarily concept of biological sex, and therefore that is what is the defining characteristic of male and female, and for that reason, biological sex is binary, and even though there are exceptions, it doesn't change the basic fact that biological sex is binary. Richard Dawkins essentially agrees with that. He said, like, for example, humans are also bipedal, and we don't consider that humans are not bipedal because a certain percentage of people are in wheelchairs. Now, that's their words, and I if again if I had any, and always says if at any point I'm mischaracterizing your position, please correct me. I do not want to strawman anyone's position. I am telling you what they're actually saying. Michael Shermer says, yeah, whatever Coin said. Literally, that's when I discussed it with him. That was his response. I agree with Coin, and I couldn't get him to really discuss it with me. He just said, that conversation blew my mind. But anyway, I'm not
What
getting
is
into that.
Shermer's background regarding science? Does he have one? I'm not even sure.
He's a historian.
Oh, okay.
Let's I don't want to get into that, but let's get back to Coyne and Dawkins. They're both evolutionary biologists, right? So with Dawkins' example, it's like, first of all, that's not a good example of people in a wheelchair. A better example would be people who are quadrupeds. Are there any people who walk on four limbs? It turns out there are. There are people who have a neurological variant where they walk on hands and feet. It's like a couple of families. It's really rare, but they exist. Now, does that mean that humans are not bipedal? No. It means we're not completely bipedal. It means we're not strictly bipedal. It means that there are humans who are not bipedal. And what's interesting, and I think ironic, and I think that they would bristle at me saying this, but I don't think this is a straw man, is that for a couple of evolutionary biologists, they're using a very creationist definition of species, right? You're saying that there's a pure type, that there's a type of human with no variation? Or isn't it true that every species has, we don't even go, evolutionary biologists don't even like to use the type species anymore, even though we do, that the type species. So for every species, there's a male and a female that represent. That's the species. Those two individual specimens. That's the species, and that is a very creationist concept. It's a very creationist approach. And modern biologists say, well, here's 20 specimens representing the range of features that we see in this species. And without that, you aren't really capturing the full breadth of variation that occurs. And yet they're reverting to this really essentialist, very type species kind of approach. Well, humans are bipedal. Humans are strictly binary when it comes to sex. And all this variation doesn't really count. It doesn't change the fact that humans are binary, sexually binary, or that they are bipedal. It's like, well, it's okay to say that humans are mostly bipedal or they're mostly, they're binary, but they're not completely, because variation is part of evolution. Everything varies. There's a variance. Again, if you're a birder and you say, what does this species of bird look like? You very quickly recognize when you go out looking at actual birds in the wild that there's a lot of what birders technically call weirdos. That's their term for them, right? There are lots of birds that don't match the picture in the book, because the picture in the book is like, here's a male, whatever, and here's a female, whatever, but there's lots of variation because that's the nature of things. So humans vary in terms of our sexual orientation. We vary in terms of our gender identity. We vary in terms of every aspect of sexual features of biological sex. That's normal. That's everything. That's what we are. We are not binary. We are a variable species like every other species in existence. And we vary in every possible way that's compatible with being alive that you could imagine. There's even quadrupedal humans. It's so fucking ironic that Dawkins used that example, used it wrong in two different ways. He used pathology when he should have used a variation, and then he discounted the variation as not being part of a species when that's actually the evolutionary view of it. That's the modern evolutionary view. And he was reverting to a creationist view. And I'm sure he would consider that a straw man if he heard me say that, but it's true. Explain to me why that's not true, and I'll change my mind.
Well, and I think you bring up a really important point there, that a lot of what we hear, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth or say that everyone is making the same argument or thinking the same thing, but oftentimes when we hear people arguing for this very binary view of sex in humans, it comes along with some religious ideology or
Yeah.
some ideology that we can maybe trace back to a religious belief system. And I think it's really interesting that we see that creeping in sometimes even among people that are well known and renowned skeptics. Not the well known skeptic, because we have the well known skeptic here with us, and he doesn't think that way. But um, what do you think is going on there when we see, particularly around this particular issue, some of these kind of religious tropes creeping back into people's arguments? What's going on?
I think that it is hugely generational, um, and that there is just a massive ick factor, for lack of a better term, associated with the concept that not all people are strictly binary when it comes to biological sex. They have a hard time wrapping their head around that idea, and they have found a convenient, motivated reasoning to justify that opinion. And they're just turning a blind eye to the fact that they are now, again, massively ironically, carrying intellectual water for the religious right and the white nationalists. And they don't even know that they're being a tool. I mean, and I'm not just making this up. Like, in my conversation with people that I am otherwise aligned with in sort of the skeptical activism, who are on the Jerry Coyne end of the equation, they are literally partnering with with right wing nut jobs who are involved in who are prosecuting the culture war because they think they're aligned on this issue when really they're just being used as a tool on this issue. So Coyne, for example, like for just to give you an example of how the conversation flows, it's like, well, what should we do about trans female athletes in elite sports? It's like, well, it's complicated by it's because it's athletically female, blah blah blah, the whole thing. And they say, well, but biological sex is strictly binary. It's like, well, it isn't. It's like, well, it is if you only consider gametes. It's like, but gametes are not relevant to the athletic issue, but it doesn't matter. It's like, well, dudes shouldn't be in women's sports. I'm just trying to protect women. I'm just trying to. That's what Shermer keeps saying. I'm just trying to protect women. You obviously don't care about women. I'm just trying to protect women and children, and that's the moral panic angle of it. So they're sort of caught up in the moral panic. You know, they they don't understand the complexity of the medical aspect of it, the gender affirming care thing. So the idea of, and I get this, I'm a parent. You know, one of the things about being a parent is that you fall in love with this child, right? And you lose them at some point, no matter what. You're gonna lose them because they're gonna get older, and you obviously you continue to love them as an adult, and now you have a relationship with your adult child, but that 4-year-old that you fell in love with doesn't exist anymore, and that's just part of the reality of being a parent. And now imagine layering on top of that, as that's happening, as your child is getting older and you're sort of that you're dealing with that change. Your child tells you, oh, by the way, I'm actually a woman and I'm going to change my biological sex. Now you're really losing them, but you have to adapt. That's who they are. You have to accept, just like all parents do. You lose your child, but you gain the adult that the child becomes. You may lose whatever the your child the way you thought they were, but you're gaining the person that they really are. And you have to go with it, man. You just have to adapt to it. But I get why that's emotionally hard. And if you can rationalize in your head why it's wrong and it shouldn't happen, and that kid is just confused by the woke mind virus, and I have to protect them from that, that there's a certain, I think, appeal to that for people who, especially older people who just cannot get the concept. So, you say, yeah, but gametes, this evolutionary biologist says it is strictly binary. And so everyone starts repeating what Coyne is saying because he's created this permission to basically be a bigot. and to use that sort of bigoted approach, but he makes it sound scientific. And then if you disagree with him, you're the ideologue, right? You're a woke ideologue who's infected with the woke mind virus. And then once you get into that kind of conspiracy space, yeah, there's really no way out of it, I think. And that's what I've been finding. They're just not able, you know, uh, to really think outside of that uh, that kind of conspiracy bubble that they're in now. You know, and it is remarkable. I mean, without giving specific examples, because a lot of this is personal communication, but people who I know who are excellent skeptics making horrifically terrible arguments and violating basic rules of evidence and not, and again, I make mistakes, but when I make a mistake, I'll accept the correction, but like not accepting the correction and doubling down on horrible evidence or horrible arguments. To me, it's all shown how powerful motivated reasoning is, and that no matter how rational or skeptical or scientific you think you are not immune to it. Nobody is immune to motivated reasoning.
Yeah, and that's something we hear about on this program all the time. We talk about critical thinking quite a lot, and it's something that we all want to be ready for and
Mm,
try to inoculate ourselves against the best we can. But we all have to realize that we're not immune. We need to be constantly questioning ourselves and making sure that to the best of our ability that we're not engaging in motivated reasoning. How do you make sure that that's not what you're doing, and how can those of us who are on any side of this debate make sure that we're not engaging in motivated reasoning and that we are in fact basing our thoughts on good evidence and I would add maybe being kind to people, but
yeah.
we can probably do both at the same time, can't we?
I mean, there's no hack, there's no rule, there's no 10 easy steps, It's, and the short answer is you are engaging in motivated reasoning. That's that's the baseline of human thought process. You can't get out of that. So you just want to minimize it. It's like, it's like it's the less wrong approach, right? We're never going to be absolutely correct. We're never going to align our beliefs 100% with empirical reality. All we could do is try to get progressively less wrong. And how you do that, number one, be incredibly humble. The humility is so critical. And that's sometimes the hardest thing for science communicators and skeptics and scientists and world famous atheists, whatever, is to keep in close touch with your humility, constantly check yourself. And if somebody else who you otherwise respect disagrees with you, find out why, like, and really take that seriously. Don't just assume they've lost their mind. You really try to find out why it is that they disagree with you. And I love when somebody I respect disagrees with me, because to me that's like a great learning opportunity. It's like awesome. Either I'm going to teach them something, they're going to teach me something, or we're going to teach each other things. And generally speaking, regardless of what combination of those things happens, I usually walk away with a better, deeper understanding of the topic. And I would, again, I would love for that to happen here. I would love for all of us to have a more nuanced understanding of this topic. And certainly, I have a better understanding now than I did 3 or 4 years ago from engaging with them. It doesn't mean I think they're right, but I mean, knowing why they're wrong is a really important learning experience. It took me a while to realize, oh, this is okay. This is all about freaking semantics at the end of the day. Like it took me a real while to realize we're not disagreeing on the facts. They acknowledge that. I had this conversation with somebody where they said, like, we agreed that biological sex in humans was only mostly binary. And I was like, yeah, so right. So it's not strictly binary. And they were like, yes, right. So it's binary. It's like, okay, right. So, but we both agree that it's not strictly binary. So yeah, it's not strictly binary, but it's binary. No, no, not strictly binary is not binary. And that was the whole discussion at that point. It was just whether you want to call it binary or not. Well, who cares? You know, you're so obsessed with calling it binary, and then that gets used to again to prosecute a culture war that I don't know if you agree with it or not, or if you don't care or whatever, but it's not helping. It's not advancing our understanding or our discussion on this topic at all. It's just this completely semantic diversion. Um, but it's and they just they get so personal and so mean about it too. It's like, God, what is they got something stuck really far up their ass about this issue, seriously, that just back off and just let's just think about this, rationally for a moment and try to actually understand. That's the other thing. It's like at no point are they trying to actually understand my position. I'm really trying to understand their position. But my experience has been that I always can tell when I'm talking with somebody who's engaging with me and somebody who's not engaging with me. That's just talking at me and refuting positions they think I have or they've heard other people say, but are not the things I'm saying right now. And versus somebody who's actually engaging with and trying to understand what I'm saying. And I have to say, the people on the other side that we're talking about, they're not engaging with me and they're not making an attempt to understand my position, and they're just talking at me with sort of their pre-packaged position, and then I will correct them, and then the next time they talk about it, they completely mischaracterize my position again. That's unacceptable. There's really no excuse for that, for like complete failure to engage. At least understand my position if you're going to try to refute it. You can disagree with me, but don't disagree with some ridiculous cartoon straw man that you've invented in your head. At least engage with what I'm saying. The other clue, big clue, is like when I'm having these discussions, I usually open up by acknowledging the points on the other side that I agree with. Like, okay, I agree with you on A, B, and C. And then here's where I disagree, or here's where I think there's more nuance, or this is where I think that you're going astray, or this is the point I think you're missing. And when they refer to me, they never acknowledge any points that they agree with that I'm making. That's always a big clue. It's always just you're wrong, you're an ideologue, blah, blah, blah. You think this ridiculous thing. And so that's, if so you asked how do you minimize the motivated reasoning on your own side. Well, that's a good rule of thumb. Go out of your way to acknowledge the legitimate points on the other side. Go out of your way to find common ground, and that's a much more productive way to proceed.
Steve, I remember 20-ish years ago when Pluto was demoted, there
Yeah,
were people so angry, including some astronomers, about the fact that you could possibly change the definition of what this object was. I mean, do you see any correlation there?
absolutely. Yeah, that's why I had a picture of Pluto in my slides. Demoted, by the way, is a value judgment.
Sure.
Uh, dwarf planets are perfectly fine. They're just as good as planets. No, seriously, it's so arbitrary. But they had a reason for doing what they did. I wrote about this recently actually because the again it's what choices are important to you. The problem was we were discovering all these Kuiper belt objects, and by the current definition of planet, they were worried like, oh my God, in 10, 20 years we could have 100 planets. That doesn't feel right. We can't have that many planets. We have to have a way of protecting the legacy planets from all of these newcomers in the Kuiper belt. So they came up with the gravitational dominance thing, but Pluto kind of got swept up in that. Like it wasn't their intent to reclassify Pluto, but they had to in order to keep Ceres and Haumea and Maki Maki and Eris become full planets, which they didn't like. Again, for no objective reason, it just didn't feel right for there to be that many planets.
Oh, we'd have to change the my very earthy mother, dot, 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 dot. It would be
Whatever.
such a
So
long thing.
they compromise. Okay, we'll make a separate category for them called dwarf planets, and then to make everybody, all the Pluto lovers, feel better, if you're a trans-Neptunian dwarf planet, you're a Plutoid, which nobody says, but that's so there's Ceres, which is a asteroid belt dwarf planet, and then there's every other dwarf planet is a Plutoid because it's a trans-Neptunian Plutoid. dwarf planet. So whatever, it's all arbitrary. It just doesn't make but what the point is, thinking about how the origin of bodies in the solar system, and and how they behave and whatever. And we got to call them something, so we got to, when we communicate with each other, we got to use the same terminology. So part of it is just convention. Same thing in medicine. We label things partly just so we could talk to each other about it. So I could look up in the literature this thing, that I'm interested in, and it has a name. Then 20 years from now, somebody will change the name because we discovered something new about it. And but that's the way it is, But it has a purpose to it. It's not objective reality, It's just I'm using these labels for a specific purpose, right? You're athletically female. I love that term because it kind of really cuts to the bone. It's like that's what we're interested in. I'm not interested in any other aspect of this, just that whether you just the athletic component. And we need to be able to talk about this in that context without getting caught up in the broader culture war over bathrooms and prisons and gender affirming care. We don't care. I just want to know who we should count as athletically female with respect to this specific sport and this specific competition. And that's fine. I think that's legitimate, and that's the way we should be talking about it. Right. But again, it's just all labels. It's just all completely arbitrary. Doesn't mean it's meaningless. Doesn't mean there isn't a reason for it. Like you can justify why you like gametes as the defining characteristic of biological sex. That's fine. It doesn't mean that it's objectively real in every single context imaginable, though. That's where they way overplay their hand, and they also just make that category mistake. Again, it's like, yeah, but we're talking about sports, right? And when I get their back against the wall and say, so why don't we have sperm leagues and ovary leagues? Then they say, well, you're making it political. Like, well, how am I making it political? And it's just a dodge, first of all, because they know that it makes no sense. That's been my experience. I don't have anybody who I would love to have asked that of Jerry Coyne if he came on my show. Why don't we have sperm leagues and ovary leagues? And if we don't, why not? And then, so how do we define biological sex in the context of elite sports? And, why is that unscientific? Anyway, I have not had that opportunity.
Because you want to change things, Steve, and it's always better to leave things the way they were.
Hey, I get it. And, I'm sure most of us have gone through this. Like, we grew up in a binary world and now we have to, it's more complicated than we thought. And it's disorienting. I get it. But grow the fuck up,
I promise we'll be okay. We're going to learn even more new things besides about this, and it's okay.
I had to be schooled on this. I had, simplistic views of this. I mean, obviously my medical training gave me a big leg up, but even when, the sort for, in the last 10, 20 years started to become a big social issue, people had to educate me about like a lot of the nuances of it. I didn't get it. It takes time. You just got to be open to it.
One of the things that I really appreciate the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe for is, and I learned this from watching, when I found it, by the way, I was 10 years into it, and I went back and I listened to every single episode.
As you should, yeah.
As everyone should. But the point was almost every time, maybe every other, you mentioned something, this is more complex than you would otherwise think.
Yeah.
Like, right, that's a very important
That's
point.
a mantra, yeah. It's more complex than you think.
Like, not by this, I don't just mean the biological sex. I mean
everything.
Every subject you investigate is more complex than people think on the face of it.
It always is. One of my favorite examples, I'm sure I've said it on the show before, is when I was going to my fellowship in neuromuscular medicine. And so neuromuscular medicine is a subspecialty of neurology that involves 4 areas: the nerves, the muscles, the neuromuscular junction, and motor neurons. And so there was, in my little fellow library, there was 2 books that probably combined were about that thick. It was like an encyclopedia just on muscle disease. It's like, oh shit, this is way more complicated than I thought it was. It's like the knowledge is even in a really narrow area is incredibly deep. And part of that is the realization that unless you're a world expert on something, you're not an expert. You don't really know what you're talking about. At best, you can have an approximation of what the experts are telling you. And that's kind of always my goal. I just want to make sure that as far as deep as I do go, I'm not disagreeing with the experts who actually know what's going on, right? Like, do you know what a black hole is? No, you don't. Unless you're a black hole expert, you have no idea what they are. You have what you think of as a black hole is a metaphor that they made up to teach you mathematically illiterate rubes, kind of, sort of, what a black hole is, just so you have something to anchor your understanding to. But it's not what a black hole is. It's, unless you are doing the math, you don't know what it is. And you have to be okay with that, or you have to invest years of study to get to the point where you have the right to have an opinion about what a black hole is. And that's the way everything is. Everything is super complex and you don't really get it. You just get an approximation of it that the experts are telling you, which is probably mostly a metaphor. Um, right? So,
Yeah, yes, but what's really unfortunate is people get a basic, not even a basic, an initial understanding or
yeah,
concept of all of these sciences or whatever in grade school, and then they think they're experts, and then they
exactly.
post all on social media like they know what the hell they're talking about. And no, those
Exactly.
people who claim to have degrees in this, they don't know what they're talking about. They're wrong. I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah. That's like all of TikTok. Yeah,
Yeah.
basically.
True story. Well, we do have a lot of people here who attend RfRx who want to learn more and be less wrong and believe more true things and fewer untrue things. And we have a lot of more questions to ask. So let's dive in. Rob, do you want to pick one or shall I?
Wow, this is the most I've ever seen at this point. All right,
A
let me.
lot of questions.
So this is a non-contentious one, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, but we'll see. Do deviations from the XX and XY allow one to reproduce?
It depends, is the short answer. So, um, a lot of times the differences of sexual development do result in infertility, but not always. They don't. Some do not. The chromosomal ones are always iffy. They usually do result in infertility, but not always. If they always did, then we would never evolve chromosomal differences, but clearly we do. So occasionally things can still line up, but it's probability goes way down.
Okay, thank you. Ara?
Okay, let's see what else we have here. We have quite a lot. Okay, we have a question here about terminology. And you can let us know if you have thoughts on this or if we should look for advice elsewhere. Someone is asking, as they're learning about how to talk about this topic, is the term cis passing an acceptable term to use? Like
So what do
someone
you
who
mean?
passes as a
Yeah,
cis
yeah, yeah.
woman.
I mean, it's acceptable from what perspective? Again, I'm not one to say whether it's culturally acceptable.
Mhm.
It seems a little um, dismissive. You know, the way it's been used to me, like when I'm arguing with somebody, usually about gender affirming care, saying, "Oh, they're just trying to pass," to cis pass. I'm like, that's kind of dismissive. It's actually about a lot more than that. But and I haven't used that term. I haven't encountered that term uh, in the technical medical literature. It's only been in discussing it with the public, and usually it is used in a way that's kind of dismissive. But I don't know if what that means. I mean, I don't know if people may use that legitimately and non-judgmentally or whatever. I just haven't encountered that.
Mhm. Good to know. Yeah. And we have had a lot of discussion in the chat tonight where people are talking about gender as well. And that was not the talk that came up this evening, but certainly there are a whole lot of social
Yeah.
and cultural issues that you have alluded to that do arise as a
Mhm.
result of or related to this conversation that we're having. So that is definitely a whole other topic that we can get into on another program and that we have talked about on some previous episodes and is certainly a salient conversation to continue having. So,
And I am not an expert on, and I would not pretend to be.
and we love that answer on this program. I don't know
Yeah.
always a good answer when that is the case. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us and passing on that question. See what I did? Okay, you're up, Rob.
Okay, wow, and I know where this question came from because this was in a Jerry Coyne blog. Do transgender women actually commit more violence in prison?
Do trans women commit more violence in prison? Is that the
Yes.
question?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. What I do know is that they're the target of violence way more. So if you break it down into, you know, cis versus trans men versus women, trans women are the highest target. And the number I'm remembering, I could look it up really quickly, but it's like 12 times or 8 times, something like that. Some significant number of
Jeez.
times the target of it. I also know that, because again, this came up in a conversation, I had to look it all up. This is like a couple of months ago, so I'm going on a fairly recent memory. But the the question was about transferring trans women to women's prison, and um, the other person was claiming that all you have to do is declare yourself a woman and you'll be transferred to a female prison. It's like, well, actually, if you look at the statistics, the vast majority of people who actually apply to be transferred to a female prison are denied. And they're denied because of their very strict criteria in place. So if the majority of them are being denied their request, then clearly you have to do more than just make the request in order to be transferred. So there appears to be a process in place, and yeah, this is state specific and versus federal, whatever. So it's multiple answers depending on what state you're talking about or what prison system you're talking about. And if you look at their criteria, it is about protecting the both the individual who's making the request, but also protecting the female inmates. Like that is the goal. The ultimate goal is to minimize the risk of harm to everyone involved. But it certainly sounds like they are erring on the side of protecting the cis female inmates in the female prison, when in fact it's the trans female inmates in the male prisons who are at the highest risk by far. So those are the statistics that I remember off the top of my head. Um, but I'm sure that's that information's available if you're interested.
Kara, you want to ask the next one?
Okay. Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Let's see if we can get two more in. One question is, how do we effectively challenge the binary narrative and communicate that biological sex is far more complex than gametes alone? And I realize you have spent some time telling us about that this evening, but do you have a quick answer to that or a bit of advice for those of us going out into the world who may encounter this argument in the future?
I mean, again, it's always complicated because when your answer is it's more complicated, by definition, the answer is complicated. There is no simple way to convey that it's complicated. It is good to have references at your fingertips to say, like, this is my understanding that there are people who don't fit a strict binary, that obviously there are features of biological sex that are more than gametes. People are more than gametes, right? We're not single-celled creatures. And the other thing is like the definition thing. It's like, well, you can choose to define it one way or the other, but this is always a bit arbitrary, a bit context dependent. Um, and here's some references for you to read, if you want to do a deep dive on it. That's always a good approach. But if you're looking for like a zinger, which I don't think is a good way to argue, but I do think a good conversation starter is, should we have sperm sports leagues and ovary sports leagues? And if not, why not? And what should we have? And then, right, so if the gametes only thing is just so silly, but that's to put it in the context of the discussion, that's sort of a good way to reframe it.
And wouldn't it be sperm and egg to make the
whatever. Yeah.
Well, then the sperm's always going to win because the eggs don't move, so
Yeah, that's true. But the eggs are a lot bigger though. They could deadlift.
If they roll over, they can kill the sperm. That's true.
All right, Rob, you want to ask one more and then we'll review the poll results?
Okay, so someone asked about a book I am not familiar with. Maybe Steve is, maybe he's not. What are your thoughts on Helen Joyce's book, Trans When Ideology Meets Reality? Have you read that book?
I have not read that book.
No,
Sorry.
okay. Let's ask one more question then. All right. In real life, how have people been handling the awkward period when people come out as trans but haven't yet had any gender affirming care? At what point did, well, let me ask you specifically about Chelsea Manning get transferred from a men's prison to a women's prison? I didn't know that had happened.
So, for gender affirming care, I have read the standard of care, right? So, there is published standard of care, and then each clinic has their own standard of care. And generally speaking, that standard is to first you socially transition, and then when you feel comfortable with the socially transitioning, then you can progress to taking puberty delaying hormones if you haven't gone through puberty yet. And then if you feel comfortable with that aspect of it and you're still agree that this is what you want to do and you still have a stable sort of trans identity and you're comfortable with your social transition and delaying puberty, then we can have a conversation about cross-sex hormones. And then once you're comfortable with that aspect of your transition, and again, still feel like you're on the right track, and you're an adult, then you can talk about surgical transitioning. So it is by definition a multi-step process. That's the standard of medical care, and it should take time, and you will be, but each step of the way, you have to sort of experience it and say, yep, this is what I want, this is what I'm comfortable with, let's move forward. So, I think going into it, you have to be aware, like there's no instant transition here. There's no instant fix. It is going to be a long process by definition. And you just have to go into that with your eyes open because that has to be the case. Um, just for medical, ethical, and moral reasons.
Okay, thank you. So since that's probably the last question, is that true, Cara? Yeah, I wanted to mention anybody wants to hear you talking a little bit about this, more about this subject. 2 weeks ago on the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, May 15th episode, I just listened to that. You had an interview with Professor Dave,
Mm-hmm.
partly on this subject, and
Got into it a little bit. Yeah,
I wrote one of his quotes. They, I guess they mean the other side, are trying to impose a rigid mathematical certainty onto the biological world, which in a way that does not fit it. So I thought that sounded fascinating. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Novella, for
My pleasure.
spending your time with us and sharing a lot of really good information with us. I am going to drop into the chat your links for social media where people can find you, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
And I will put those there. And so we also dropped the link for the Skeptics Guide to the Universe earlier, since we mentioned that. And I know a lot of people were asking for where they could find more information, and I bet they can follow you and look at some of the other content you're putting out and some of your publications to find even more. Is that?
By the way, Steve, do you want to mention your not a conference that's coming up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We are doing this is going to be, I want to get the dates right. So let me look it up really quick rather than taking a chance that I give you the wrong date. May 15th, 16th, 17th is not a con. So it is a conference, even though we call it not a conference, basically, because there's not going to be lectures and seminars, right? It's going to be, every event is geared towards being entertaining and interactive. So it's like the muffin top, right? It's like the best top part of a muffin. This is the muffin top of conferences. It's all the fun parts and the best parts of a conference without the boring sitting and listening just to a didactic lecture. So it's going to be a lot of interactive things, a lot of workshops. We will do a live SGU show. There's a lot of games, music, entertainment, a lot of socializing time. We did it last year. It was a ton of fun. Yeah, so just go to the SGU website. You'll see how to sign up for it there.
And where is it this year?
It is in the same place in White Plains.
Okay.
Excellent. And I dropped a link in the chat so people can click that and check that out if they would like to. And before we wrap up, we like to share the results of the poll that we did at the beginning. And let me do that now. So, at the very beginning of the show, we asked the audience, do you think biological sex in humans is binary? And the results are as follows: 7% of the people here tonight said yes, 56% said no, 27% said it's complicated, and 10% said don't know or never thought about it. Now, Stephen, how does that breakdown strike you? Is that about what you would expect? Is that typical, atypical? I'm sure it depends on the
Typical.
context.
It's totally audience dependent. Surveys are tricky. I mean, in reality, surveys are tricky. I know, like Jerry Coyne was promoting on his blog a recent survey of scientists who were asked this question, and I think it was flipped. It was like 53 or 54% said sex is binary, but the question was, is biological sex binary? Then there was an asterisk, and next to that it said, if you don't count people with intersex conditions.
Oh man,
So
that's not
talk about a useless. So if you don't count all the people who are not binary, is biological sex binary? How you ask the question is, and the context of it is so important. It's almost worthless scientifically. So I think this is just reflecting the audience, and you would get very different results in different venues and different ways you ask the question. The order in which you ask questions, the title of the talk you asked the question before, all of that.
Oh, definitely. And if I ever ask a question like that one you just described, I hope all of the audience will message me in the chat and say, Kara, what are you doing writing a question like that? But yeah, we are, of course, polling ourselves in here. So
Yeah.
this is not by any means, Pew research coming out of this.
Are
This
you saying
beginning.
this poll is not a scientific poll, Kara?
It's not. I'm afraid it's
Oh,
not. This is just for fun. And so the next question that we asked was, does or did your religious community promote a specific view on the subject? And 56% of people said yes, it did, and it was strictly binary. 8% of people said yes, and it was not strictly binary. I'd be interested to hear in the
yeah.
chat
What's that
what
about?
tradition those people were coming from. And then 6% said no, and 30% said either not applicable or they're not sure what the position was. So that was an interesting one. And then we had number 3: if you have left a religious community, have your views on this subject changed since? Now this is interesting. 63% of people said yes, 15% said no, and 23% were not sure or not applicable. And now, of course,
That
just
kind of squares up the first two questions, right? I mean, it would have
yeah.
to be the case
Mm-hmm.
for 1 and 2 to have the results that they did.
That's true. That is an excellent observation, and it does kind of go back to what we touched on earlier about how there does kind of tend to be this lingering kind of religious aspect for many people that features into this conversation, whether it's explicitly stated or not. It does seem to come up quite often. Okay, and then finally, the most important question is always our last one: which of these franchises does it best? And we mean by that characters that change sex. And in the answer choices, we have 34% of people selected Star Trek, which I may have primed us a little bit by suggesting that that might be the best answer. So, again, not a scientific exercise that we're doing here. 8% of people selected Doctor Who, 15% selected X-Men, 3% picked Red Dwarf, 17% for Loki, and 22% selected other. And I'm not sure if I noticed in the chat if anybody put what their other selections were, but I would love to see it and hear about it.
We'll have to talk about that in the hangout. Yeah, I didn't see
I would
that.
say the Orville, by the way. The Orville would be in the other.
Yes, very good. I have forgotten about that instance. Yes, and there was forced on the families, right? If I recall. Yeah.
Forced transgenderism.
Yes. And everyone had to be a male.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh,
Oof.
All right. Well, we'll definitely stick around with us for the hangout if you want to chat more. And we'll go ahead and wrap up now. Don't forget to join us next week, same time, same channel. Some of the upcoming speakers that we have include Mallory Mackey, Nicholas Souter, Erica Matthews, and Margaret Downey. And thank you once again, everyone, for joining us, and for all of the hosts and co-hosts and production crew and social media folks and troll stompers and everybody behind the scenes that makes this happen. And thank you, of course, Steve, for joining us and sharing.
Thank you,
And
everyone.
yeah,
Thank you for
and
taking my invitation, Steve. This was fantastic.
Always a pleasure.
it was great. And don't forget to follow us too on social media. It helps us reach more people, and it helps more people find out about our programs and services. Of course, you are not required to follow us or like or share if that is going to out you to your family as someone who's questioning or anything like that. You feel comfortable, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Bluesky, and of course on YouTube as well. And Rob, how else can people get involved?
We have something here which helps everybody help themselves as well as help other people. It's called volunteering. We've learned that healing can come from helping other people, and the volunteers at Recovering from Religion find meaning and purpose by doing so with us. All of the services that we offer are done by volunteers, and we're always in need of new people, or old people, or anyone, just more people. And there's all sorts of things you can do besides working the more well-known crisis helpline that we have. We need people to find, vet, post good resources for our clients to use. We need people to host support groups, support the online community you heard about before. We even need people to upgrade our software for both our clients and our agents to use. We're always doing that. So to apply to volunteer, go to our main page, click the volunteer button, which is recoveringfromreligion.org/volunteer. And lastly, I'm going to tell you again, I say this every week, there's a 3-minute video, not 30 minutes, 3-minute video on our main page called RFR What We Do. And it's in 3 minutes, you'll hear everything it took Cara and I 15 or 20 to tell you at the beginning. And you could refresh your memory about what we do there. You could send it to any friends or family who you think might be in use of our services, be in need of our services. 3 minutes long. Okay, thank you.
All right. And with that, let's bring on Dr. Ray to give us some closing thoughts, as we like to say, the benediction from the high priest of the flying spaghetti monster.
I don't think Steve right knows that I'm the high priest, so let's not shock him too much. Steve, thank you so much for coming tonight. I have literally listened to you for a decade or more. I mean, I can't remember when I first discovered you, and I've always amazed at how you can take a very what looks like a simple subject, and by the end of the podcast, you think, "Oh shit, this is a hell of a lot more complicated than I thought it was." You're a master at that, and you really are good at teaching us that we need to be more thoughtful and examine our assumptions. So anyway, I'm
Well,
a
thank
great
you.
admirer of that. I don't know how you and I have never crossed paths. I mean, a conference or something. But
Come to Nauticon.
well, my travel schedule is crazy, so I
hear
probably
you.
won't.
I hear you. Well, I'm sure
try
that
to
we'll
do.
cross paths at some point.
I'm sure we will. But thank you so much for coming here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
There, I really like. I'm a psychologist, have been for 40 years or so. But when you said, what's more important, the penis or the brain, the vagina or the brain? Okay, that's the essence of my experience, because when I have somebody sitting in front of me who's reporting something that's very different than the way they present, it took me years to finally figure out, oh, they're telling me the truth. And it's how deeply we were programmed, often by religion, particularly by religion. So it's hard to get past those black and white, good, bad, right, wrong kind of categories. When I first got open to it, I don't know if you know Dr. Veronica Drans. Have you heard of her?
No.
She's a PhD professor of nursing up in Chicago, I believe. I heard her give a lecture up in Wisconsin about 10, 15 years ago, and it was on this very subject. And she was just brilliant at the way she explained it. And that was when my eyes first opened to realize what I'd been seeing all along. You see something clinically, you don't know what it is until you got a good label for it, I guess you could say. You've kind of talked about that already. So that was one of the interesting, I'm going to try and put the link up in here, Kara, if I can find Dr. Duran's lecture. Oh, by the way, Stephen, we have the newest airport on the planet here in Kansas City where I live, and it has all genders restrooms, and we've not had a single riot. And even the Republicans
Imagine that.
haven't gone crazy. They even fly through the airport without making comments. So it's rather interesting. I also like the extrovert introvert thing. I like the right-handed, left-handed. You know, all those things. Humans are just, there's a broad spectrum of us, and when you try to put it into one or the other. So when somebody asked earlier, what's a good way to couch this, and you suggested, gosh, I just drew a blank. Anyway, I would also suggest talking to people about left and right-handed and ambidextrous people, and because we're just a wide range of things. Have you heard of Nathan Lentz and his new book, The Sexual Evolution?
I've heard of it. I have not read it.
I read a pre-published a manuscript copy of it. It just came out a few months ago. I really liked it, and it follows right along with what you've said here. So I would recommend
Dr.
it.
Length is going to be our speaker, by the way, for people. He's on, let's see, 519. The sexual evolution, the deep roots of sex, gender, and sexuality will be the topic.
Okay, great. Darn, Roger. Rob, okay, you guys are ahead of me. I'm usually ahead of you guys, but okay. There's another book. I like Carl Zimmer's book. She Has Her Mother's Laugh. I don't know. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was pretty good. It's not focused just on this issue, but it sure does show that genetics is a hell of a lot more complicated than what we're making it out to be.